sort of plot, this is discharge, this is effective field discharge on this axis here. It's not actually the discharge we put in the flume. If you plot velocity, flow depth, and Froude number, and you look at the field data and the flume data, they all seem to show sort of quite convincing parallel relationships, which is kind of as we would expect if we just plotted up data from the field across a range of discharges. So it looks relatively convincing in terms of the behaviour that we're getting in the flume is actually reproducing a sort of reasonable behaviour that we might also expect to see in the field and the higher discharges. So in terms of the scaling, we're sort of reasonably happy that it does seem to be working. Okay, so the question is, what does this sort of spatial pattern of hydraulics look like as it changes through discharge? So what we've got here are 5 different images, and each one of these images shows the sort of combination of downstream and cross-stream velocities at each of these different 18 locations. And this is the lowest discharge up here, and this is the highest discharge up here. And the colour scale is basically relative to sort of average velocity for each one of those different components. And the length of the arrows is telling you the absolute velocity. And what you find is that, I guess to start with, there's quite a lot of spatial variability within this bed. And it's not that surprising, but if we've got this sort of variable topography, we do tend to find that we get a lot of spatial variability. What's also more notable is the way that variability changes as you increase the discharge. So for example, at 20 litres per second, we've got these relatively high velocities at this downstream end, but they're not really connected to sort of any upstream parts of the bed. Whereas at 60 litres per second, we do get this sort of core of high flow which starts to run through the model. So we're going to get this sort of increased connectivity between different parts of the bed as we increase the discharge. If we look at the range of velocities, we also find that actually the variation in velocity seems to increase as we increase the discharge in the model. So this is bulk discharge on this axis here, this is velocity, and then each one of these points is a different one of those 18 locations. And the lines join up points, sort of the same point under different discharges. So we find we get this increase in variation of velocity, which is some ways surprising because there has been suggestions in the literature that what tends to happen is that actually as you increase the velocity and increase the discharge in a bedrock river, sort of all the effects of the morphology just kind of wash out and everything might actually become more uniform. Whereas this actually doesn't seem to be the case that we're getting here. The other thing we find, if you follow some of these pathways through, you can see that there's actually some points in the river whereby if you increase the discharge, the local velocity actually decreases rather than increases. So it's suggesting that actually, again, the picture on a point-by-point scale is actually sort of getting really quite complicated. If we try and sort of dig into this a little bit more about what's sort of impacting these pattern of velocities, we can see that if we look at flow depth against point elevation, unsurprisingly, there's a sort of fairly straightforward relationship that generally at high elevations you've got lower flow depths, you've got sort of a vaguely linear relationship like that. And as you increase the discharge, you get a similar shape of relationship, but obviously it just moves up. So that's sort of maybe not that surprising. If you look at the relationship between elevation and velocity, you actually get quite a lot of scatter in the data. There isn't really an obviously clear relationship between the elevation of the bed you are and the velocity of that flow over it. So it looks like elevation sort of isn't the only thing that's driving that variation of velocity that we're seeing. If you look at, for each of those 18 locations, you look at how the depth changes between 20 and 60 litres per second, and you also look at how the velocity changes between 20 and 60 litres per second, and you plot this change in velocity divided by the change in depth, and you plot that against elevation. If you ignore these sort of 2 points up here, you tend to find that you generally, the higher points in the bed have a larger increase in velocity, whereas the lower points in the bed have a relatively high increase in water depth instead. So again, it's suggesting that elevation is actually, in terms of sort of flow continuity, we're getting slightly different behaviours from different elevations within the bed. If we then sort of move on to think about sort of the roughness of the system and how that's changing, again, just coming back to one of these sort of scaling relationships, this is field equivalent discharge, this is Manning-Zen, Darcy-Weisbach. If we look at the field and the flume, again, they do seem to plot in a sort of linear fashion. So I guess comparable with sort of other data from other bedrock rivers, we do seem to have this general sort of power law relationship whereby we've got a decrease in roughness as we increase the discharge. So that in itself is sort of maybe fairly straightforward. But if we actually start to look at the details of that relationship, you can see that actually we've got this decrease in roughness between sort of 20 and 40 litres per second discharge, and then it kind of seems to stabilise. So in the way that that flow, the variation in flow mainly occurred between sort of 20 and 40 litres per second, we seem to be getting a similar change in roughness between 20 and 40 litres per second. So I guess what this is showing is, in comparable, as has been demonstrated in a lot of other rivers, it's not just the morphology isn't the only thing that's determining the roughness, it's the way in which that flow is running over the roughness and sort of interacting with it. And also we seem to have some sort of stabilisation of the flow occurring and a discharge of about 40 litres per second. So there's this question, okay, with that sort of the bulk roughness, what happens if we try and look at a point scale? And if we know what the topography of the bed is, can we try and identify whether there's a sensible roughness length that we should be using to characterise this bed with? And so what this plot shows is that this is a plot of window size along here, and then this is standard deviation of elevations on this axis here. And so effectively what this is doing is putting a window of a certain size over the bed, for each one of those windows calculating the standard deviation of elevations within that window, and then each one of these box plots is showing that distribution. And what you find is that basically as you increase the window size, you might expect that you'll get to a window size and then kind of everything will stabilise and it wouldn't change a lot. But actually that doesn't really seem to be the case. If you look at the mean of this distribution, which is the star, and also the median, which is the line, they both just seem to continue to increase as you increase the window size. So it's actually quite hard to look at this figure and say, okay, well, that's clearly a representative size that we should be using to quantify the roughness of this bed. It seems to be very much sort of scale dependent. Which is potentially problematic given there is an assumption that we can just take standard deviation of elevations and that will give us a roughness length. But I guess if we really had to look at this diagram and say, okay, well, what could we try and approximate from this diagram? You might say, well, if you look at the largest range that we get in this distribution, it's somewhere around a window size of about 180 millimetres. So maybe we need a window that is at least that big to try and capture that sort of local variability. You could also say, okay, if you look at the mean, it increases rapidly and then it kind of levels off a bit with a sort of inflection point around sort of there. So maybe somewhere between 100 and 150 again is maybe sufficiently big to start to capture that sort of local variability, and maybe that increase up here is maybe of less important. So if that's our sort of local roughness at a range of scales, the question is, okay, well, how does that, can we sort of relate that to those flow data that we've measured? So for each of those 18 locations under the different discharges, we know what the velocity was, we know what the depth was, and we sort of estimated the water surface slope from those pairs of measurements. And so basically back calculated the Manning's N value from the flow data. And so what we then did is correlated those Manning's N values against the velocity that was measured, against the roughness at each of those different locations. And that's the roughness which was measured using a different range of size windows. So again, this is window size down here, and this is the R squared of that relationship. And what you find is that the best relationship between the Manning's N calculated from the flow and that topographic roughness length occurs at a window size of about 150 millimetres. So it's actually suggesting that sort of maybe those assumptions that we made on this figure here are actually maybe not that bad in terms of estimating a roughness length. However, it's kind of worth noting that the only points at which we get these significant relationships are for those highest discharges, so for the 50 and 60 litres per second. The lowest discharges, we don't really seem to get any correlation at all between that Manning's N sort of and the local roughness. However, if we do a different, instead of looking at Manning's N, we just look at the flow velocity data themselves, we actually get quite a different relationship, whereby the only significant relationship we get is actually between velocity at the very low discharge, and we tend not to get any sort of significant relationships for those higher discharges instead. So again, it sort of suggests that this is not necessarily sort of a straightforward relationship, and what's applicable to sort of one set of discharges may not necessarily be applicable to other discharges. Okay, so moving moving on to the sort of sediment run results, the question is, we've also got sediment runs with sediment in, and the question is, okay, well, what impact does putting sediment into the flume actually have on that roughness of the bed? So this is an example of one of those sediment runs. This is where the ADV was. And we've got a little area of the bed, which is the area of flow that's sampled by that ADV. And so what we did was, for all the runs, we actually calculated the amount of sediment that was within that area of the bed. And so this plot here basically shows the discharge, and this is velocity measured, downstream velocity measured by the ADV. And the ADV data was basically split into 3-minute segments. And so this is the average discharge during each of those 3-minute segments. And what we've also got, each of those points is basically coloured, shaded according to the amount of sediment that was in that area of the bed during that 3-minute duration. So white areas, white points have got no sediment cover. The red points are actually from a run when there was no sediment in the flume at any point during the experiment. And the darkest points have got the most sediment cover. And what you can clearly see is that, again, there's quite a lot of scatter in the data, but generally the grey points tend to plot below this sort of average no sediment run line, and the darker points very much plot at the bottom. So you can see there's quite a positive impact that sediment cover does seem to be decreasing the flow velocity in a sort of way that you might expect it to, which is kind of reassuring. And also, if you look at relationships of both cross-stream and vertical velocities, you don't seem to get a strong relationship. So okay, we seem to have an impact from sediment. The question is, sort of, can we try and quantify that impact? So if we take this sort of approach to try and calculate a total roughness length of a function of a bedrock roughness length and an alluvial roughness length, we can actually try and sort of calculate the roughness length within that patch relative to the ADV. So if we take the bedrock roughness with the standard deviation of elevations just within that measurement area, so that had a value of about 3.4 millimetres. The alluvial roughness length, we used an approximation of 2D50, which is 14.6 millimetres. And so basically we use that to calculate the roughness length for each one of those 3-minute ADV measurements. And if you plot roughness length on this axis here against velocity, downstream velocity on this axis here, you see that you do actually seem to get a positive relationship. And at the moment I've put a power law through it, but I'm not actually sure that may necessarily be the best fit to that data. It may actually be. It's sort of figured from a draft paper, it works slightly better in the context of the rest of the paper.
It's a fit.
It's a fit.
Me, I fit very well.
Well, it's true. I think it is a significant relationship, from what I remember. So we're seeing that obviously we've got something which sort of does seem to show there is this relationship between roughness length and velocity. Unfortunately, during these experiments, we don't have water depth measurements or water slope measurements. There's a kind of, it's hard to take this analysis sort of much further than this. Okay, so that's kind of where we got to with the flow, is that we've got this implication that we've got this complex morphology and it does seem to be inducing quite a lot of variation in the flow. So the question is, okay, well, what does that mean for the amount of sediment cover that's going to develop within this flume? So this is a plot here. This is sediment mass on this axis here. So this is the amount of sediment that was put into the flume during each experiment. And then this is sediment cover on this axis here. So this is the amount of sediment cover that was basically in the flume after that initial 5 minutes under a constant discharge condition. And we've got sort of three different data sets on here. The white ones are data from 20 litres per second, the grey ones are 35 litres per second, and the sort of black ones are from 50 litres per second. And you see that certainly in those two data sets, you actually do seem to get quite a linear relationship between the amount of sediment that gets put in the flume and the amount of cover that develops in the flume. And in many ways, that's quite a reassuring result because of a lot of the sort of incision literature that assumes that you get this sort of linear relationship between the amount of sediment that goes into a river and the amount of sediment cover that develops, which kind of suggests that, so in this context anyway, maybe that's not an unreasonable thing to assume. Unsurprisingly, if you put the same amount of sediment in, but under a higher flow condition, you actually get less sediment cover occurring, which is obviously because a larger proportion of that sediment gets entrained and transported out to the end of the flume before it can actually form stable cover. So clearly the flow conditions potentially also quite important. This question, okay, well, where did this sediment cover develop in the bed? And we sort of started with this idea of maybe the sediment just fills in from the lowest elevations of the bed and kind of fills upwards. If that cover is sort of purely gravity driven, you might expect that that's what would occur. And what this box plot here shows is, again, this is sediment mass on this axis here for the 3 different discharges. And this is basically the elevation of parts of the bed that are covered with sediment during those different experiments. And what you can see is when we put the smallest amount of sediment in, the elevations are quite low. If we put more sediment in, basically progressively higher areas of the bed are becoming covered with sediment. So it suggests that under 20 litres per second, and we get the same pattern under 35 litres per second, we do seem to be having to large extent sort of just filling up of the bed from the bottom elevations. However, under 50 litres per second, we actually seem to get the opposite pattern occurring. And it may suggest that actually at 50 litres per second, the flow again is becoming increasingly more important in determining where that sediment gets deposited. And it was notable that under 50 litres per second, sediment seemed to be transferred further down the flume before it was actually able to form stable patches. So we say, okay, well, let's try and, if we're hypothesising that it's just filling up the bed from the bottom, we can sort of produce a very simple model. We've got the elevation model of the bed. We can just approximate the density of sediment and just basically fill up the bed from the bottom and see how much cover we get for a given mass of sediment that we just sort of effectively pour into this bed. And that's the idea of the sort of space filling model is what this line here shows. And obviously, for the space filling model, we get a higher amount of cover for a given mass of sediment because it doesn't take into account the fact that some of the sediment gets transported out of the flume before it gets deposited. But you can see that we get a sort of similar relationship. It's obviously got more of an inflection point in it, but the overall gradient is maybe not massively dissimilar. However, if we look at the results from the space filling model, we look at where the sediment patches are occurring, where it predicts that sediment patches will occur, we find that actually we do get quite a lot of difference between this sort of simple model and what we actually observe in the flume. So these very multicoloured diagrams, basically the turquoise line, or the cyan line if you can see it, that's the outline of the sediment patches that formed during the flume experiment. These kind of sort of yellowy, pinky, purple areas, these are the prediction of sediment depth of patches that are predicted by the space filling model. And what you can see is that the model predicts that we're going to get a lot of sediment cover down this part of the flume here, whereas actually in reality, the sediment cover tended to occur far more towards the centre of the flume instead, and actually we got relatively little sediment cover in this area of the flume. And the sort of main sort of explanation for that is again that we need to think back to this pattern of flow that's being induced by the bed. And if you look down this sort of central part here, although none of these flow velocities are very high, we're tending to get higher flow velocities around this area here near the wall, and lower areas in the middle. So we're getting sort of higher velocities down that part of the bed. Okay, is that 5 minutes?
At most.
At most, okay, sorry, okay. A couple more slides. So the other question we can look at is say, okay, well, what's happening to the sort of sediment cover when we try and erode that sediment cover in the bed? And it's suggesting that if this is discharge, this is sediment cover, we're kind of almost getting 3 different conditions. If we only put 2 kilos in, we get very little sediment cover occurring. If we put 4 and 8 kilos in, we actually get very similar relationships, which kind of suggests that the bed's kind of providing a template almost for that sediment patches within the flow. And if we put extra sediment cover and extra sediment in, and we put 8 kilograms in, it doesn't actually seem to produce that much more sediment cover. So it might be that under a different set of flow conditions, the bed's sort of saying, okay, well, this is the only area of the bed where sediment patches will be stable. However, if we put 16 kilograms in, we seem to start getting sort of grain-grain interactions that are occurring, which are maybe actually sort of saying, they're sort of overriding the effect of the morphology, and actually that morphology effect is maybe less important. These grain-grain interactions are stabilising the sediment patches and allowing far larger areas of sediment cover to be produced. Okay, I've also, I'll go through this slide quickly and then I'll leave it there, I think. So basically this slide is patches of, the colours demonstrate the discharge at which sediment was eroded from different parts of the bed. So blue areas are where sediment goes from very quickly, Dark red areas, areas where the sediment patches are very stable, ready eroded from very high flows. And there's kind of two main points